It happened in mid-November. General Motors didn't just issue a directive, they dropped a bombshell. In a stunning move that has sent shockwaves through the global market, the Detroit giant ordered thousands of its suppliers to effectively scrub China from their supply chains. This isn't just a business adjustment. It is one of the most forceful and aggressive responses we have ever seen to the rising tides of geopolitical tension. But after decades of deep integration, what triggered this sudden divorce? And why now? To understand the magnitude of this moment, you first have to look back. For decades, General Motors didn't just sell cars in China, it built a massive industrial home there. It started in the late 90s, when GM entered the market through mandatory 50-50 joint ventures with state-owned partners like SAIC and Wuling. They went all in. General Motors invested hundreds of millions of dollars and transferred decades of manufacturing and design know-how to the region. And they didn't just copy-paste American cars, they tailored them. They revived the fading Buick brand by catering specifically to Chinese tastes, adding extra chrome for government officials and designing spacious rear seats for chauffeur-driven executives. On the other end of the spectrum, they churned out ultra-basic $5,000 Wuling vans for rural buyers. It was a strategy that paid off in gold. By 2017, GM and its partners were selling over 4 million vehicles a year in China, actually selling more cars there than they did in the United States. The automaker had woven itself into the very fabric of China's manufacturing sector. It wasn't just about assembly lines. It was about everything. From the custom tools and dies used to stamp metal, to the intricate electronics that run the dashboard, China became the dominant global hub for these supplies, creating a system that was incredibly efficient and deeply integrated. For a long time, this was the gold standard of globalization. But then, the script flipped. On November 12, 2025, Reuters exclusively confirmed that General Motors has formally directed its suppliers to effectively scrub their supply chains of Chinese parts and materials. This wasn't a public shout. It started as a quiet conversation. GM began approaching its suppliers late in 2024. Back then, it might have felt like a suggestion. But by the spring of 2025, as trade tensions heated up, that suggestion turned into a directive with fresh urgency. The company isn't asking for a gradual drift away from China. They have set a hard deadline. For many suppliers, the target is 2027. By that date, they are expected to dissolve their China sourcing ties and deliver alternatives. And here is where it gets complicated. This order doesn't just apply to the big parts you see, like the engine block or the seats. It targets the deep tiers of the supply chain. We are talking about raw materials buried deep inside components. We're talking about lighting assemblies, electronics modules, and even the rare earth magnets used in EV motors. GM is essentially asking suppliers to map out every single bolt and circuit, identify what comes from China, and find a way to replace it. So, where is all this manufacturing going? The goal is a massive geographic shift focused on North America. This initiative specifically targets the vehicles built here, which represent the majority of GM's global production. The new rule of thumb is simple: build where you sell. GM wants parts to be sourced from the same region where the car is finally assembled. If a Chevy is rolling off a line in Michigan, GM wants the parts to come from North American factories, or at least from allied regions like Mexico. It's a strategy to bring the supply chain closer to home. And just to be clear on how strict this is, China isn't the only country on the do not source list. The directive also explicitly names Russia and Venezuela. Driven by national security concerns and trade restrictions, GM is drawing a new map for its suppliers. One where geopolitical boundaries matter just as much as the bottom line. So, why take such a drastic step? Why unravel a system that has kept costs down for decades? The answer lies in a fundamental shift in philosophy at the very top of General Motors. For years, the automotive industry was driven by a single obsession: finding the lowest price tag. But that era is ending. GM CEO Mary Barra and her leadership team have effectively rewritten the rulebook. We've been working now for a few years to have supply chain resiliency, she said during GM's quarterly conference call in October. The new priority isn't cost, it is resiliency. Shilpan Amin, GM's global purchasing chief, has been explicit about this change. Resiliency is important, making sure you have more control over your supply chain, and you know exactly what is coming where. he shared at a conference last month. The internal mindset has shifted from efficiency to survival. It is about de-risking the company from a volatile world. As Amin put it, GM can no longer afford to be blind to risks buried deep in the lower tiers of its supplier network. This internal pivot is a direct response to the chaotic political landscape outside the factory walls. Throughout 2025, the industry has been battered by what reports call US-China trade storms. The return of the Trump administration brought a wave of on-again, off-again tariffs and unpredictable policy shifts that have made long-term planning a nightmare for car executives. GM is essentially trying to hedge its bets by steering clear of Chinese content. The automaker is trying to shield itself from trade volatility, tariff hikes, and sudden export restrictions that can freeze an assembly line overnight. And this isn't just a theoretical fear. The system has already shown its cracks. Consider the Nexperia Incident. China recently imposed a ban on chip exports from Nexperia following an intellectual property dispute. This wasn't a minor glitch. The move halted shipments and left several automakers scrambling to adjust, serving as a harsh wake-up call to the fragility of these global networks. It proved that a political dispute could instantly shut down factory output. Then there was the rare earth scare. Not once, but twice in 2025. First in April, and again in October, China clamped down on the export of rare earth elements. These are the critical minerals used extensively inside modern vehicles. The restrictions sent auto companies into a panic, racing to stockpile components just to ensure they could keep building cars. These events made one thing clear to Detroit. The old supply chain wasn't just cheap, it was dangerous. When the directive landed, the reaction on the ground wasn't just concern, it was panic. Suppliers, who have spent decades optimizing every cent out of their operations, are now described as scrambling to meet these new demands. An executive at one large parts maker didn't mince words, calling it a big effort that has sent shockwaves through the Tier 1 landscape. The scale of the challenge was best summarized by Colin Shaw, the head of the Vehicle Suppliers Association. He pointed out the sheer impossibility of the timeline, noting, "In some cases, this has been 20 or 30 years in the making, and we're trying to undo it in a few years." His assessment was blunt. It's not going to happen that fast. But ready or not, the work has begun. Logistics teams are now being forced to do everything at once. As they pivot from China to countries like Vietnam or Mexico, they have to validate entirely new shipping routes, vet new carriers, and navigate unfamiliar customs processes. It is a logistical high-wire act performed without a safety net. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the atmosphere is equally tense. While Beijing hasn't issued a direct public retort to this specific GM move, the context is clear. Throughout 2025, China has thrown a series of counterpunches in response to US tariffs. We have seen them clamp down on exports of parts containing rare earth elements, components that are vital for modern cars. These moves are a signal that China is willing to effectively weaponize the supply chain, cutting off critical flows to exert pressure on Western manufacturers. Finally, this shockwave ripples all the way down to the local dealership. For the dealers on the front lines, this transition promises short-term pain. They are bracing for inventory volatility and potential delays in service bays as parts allocations get messy. But there is a silver lining: they are hoping to sell. Over time, if this plan works, they will have a powerful new story to tell their customers. A vehicle that isn't just assembled in North America, but is truly locally built and resilient against the chaos of the world. But the clearing a split is one thing, paying for it is another. This rewiring of the global machine is proving to be an incredibly expensive endeavor. We aren't just talking about changing shipping address. This requires massive new capital investment. Suppliers are having to build entirely new factories or retool existing lines in alternative regions like Mexico, Vietnam, and India. It is a construction boom born out of necessity, and the price tag is steep. The problem goes deeper than money. Over the last few decades, China didn't just build factories, it built ecosystems. The country has become the dominant hub for specific high-skill niches, particularly tool and die makers and complex electronics. These networks are deeply rooted. You can't simply walk down the street in a new country and find a workshop that can replicate the custom components China churns out with ease. Finding viable alternatives for these specialized parts is turning into a lengthy and difficult hunt. Then there is the logistical nightmare. For years, shipping from China was a predictable science. But moving these supply chains to developing regions creates what experts call a visibility problem. Suddenly, there are blind spots. Ensuring a critical part arrives just in time from a brand new facility in Vietnam is far harder than getting it from an established partner in Shanghai. The coordination isn't there yet, and the infrastructure is often still catching up. To protect themselves from this uncertainty, suppliers are being forced into a defensive crouch. They are building what is known as buffer inventory. Essentially, they have to hoard parts to ensure the assembly lines don't stop if a shipment goes missing. This panic buying creates a ripple effect. It drives up warehousing costs and spikes the demand for storage space, adding yet another layer of expense to the transition. And looming over all of this is the clock. GM has set the deadline for 2027. In the fast-paced world of consumer tech, 2 years might seem like a lifetime. But in the automotive world, where product planning cycles stretch out over many years, 2 years is blink of an eye fast. Suppliers are being asked to execute a massive pivot in a fraction of the usual time. This compressed timeline drastically increases the risk of launch delays, part shortages, and the very real possibility that when 2027 arrives, the new system won't ready to carry the load. To understand where this is going, analysts are looking at the history books. They call it the classic pattern of foreign engagement in China, a cycle that repeats with ruthless efficiency. Nurture, learn, compete, eliminate. It always starts with the lure. Global giants are welcomed with open arms and promised massive market access, on the condition that they form joint ventures and transfer technology. For years, the host absorbs capital, expertise, and decades of R&D from these partners. But once the local champions are ready, the squeeze begins. The playing field tilts. Subsidies for foreign brands dry up. Punitive tariffs are threatened. And domestic firms like BYD and Xiaomi are favored to dominate the market. The foreign partner, once essential, is pushed to the fringes. We are arguably seeing this happen right now with Tesla. The data is flashing red. In October 2025, Tesla's sales in China plummeted by 35.8% year-over-year, dropping to just over 26,000 vehicles. Its slice of the pie, once dominant, shrank to a 3-year low of just 3.2%. Meanwhile, domestic Chinese brands have captured more than 80% of the EV market. The response from the Shanghai Gigafactory tells the story. Exports hit a 2-year high of over 35,000 vehicles in the same month. The factory is no longer primarily serving the local Chinese consumer. It is becoming an export hub. The fear is that the cycle is complete. Chinese firms have mastered the technology, and the elimination phase has begun. Even historic partners are not safe. Former GM subsidiaries like Delphi, now Aptiv, who built their business on Chinese manufacturing, are finding themselves on the outside looking in, excluded from future North American supply chains to avoid national security risks. Some might see General Motors' directive as an outlier, a radical overreaction. But analysts see something else. They see a bellwether. Where GM goes, the rest of the industry is almost certain to follow. GM's move is signaling the end of the globalized one-size-fits-all supply chain. In its place, we are seeing the rise of stratified sourcing. The world is effectively being carved into regional supply blocks. Europe for Europe, Asia for Asia. And now, definitively, North America for North America. Other major automakers and Tier 1 carriers are watching closely, and behind closed doors, they are gearing up to replicate this regional fortress strategy to protect themselves from the same geopolitical storms. And if you look closely, this wasn't a sudden decision. It was the final piece of a puzzle GM has been building for years. Long before they targeted the dashboard electronics or the door handles, GM was already quietly securing the foundation. They started with the most critical vulnerabilities: batteries and computer chips. We saw them break ground by investing millions in the Thacker Pass lithium mine in Nevada. We saw them partner with US rare earth companies to bypass Chinese processing. They built the safety net for the most expensive components first. Now, with this 2027 directive, they are simply closing the loop. So, where does this leave us? We are witnessing the great rewiring of the global economy. But for China, this isn't just a lost contract, it is a structural wound. As GM unplugs from its Asian supermarket, it threatens up to $30 billion in export value and puts over 300,000 jobs at risk, from the assembly line to the engineer's desk. General Motors is placing a massive bet on a new reality. They are betting that in a dangerous world, accepting higher costs is better than risking a total collapse. As the 2027 deadline approaches, the map is being redrawn. The era of the borderless factory is closing. The message to the world is clear. The age of build everywhere is over. The age of build here has begun.